Hello, in this video I'm going to show you the 7 most important ways to adjust the brightness or exposure of a photograph or a video. And we'll be using CameraBag for our adjustments here. And most of these adjustments apply across different photographic photo editing softwares. But there are a few things that will be specific to CameraBag, but generally you can apply this in Lightroom or whatever other software you might be using. So let's dive right in. And we're going to be looking a lot at the histogram in this video, which basically I won't go into it in too much detail here, but it basically shows how many pixels are at each brightness level in your image. So the left side of this represents the darkest pixels that are black, like in this bark here, and the lightest pixels are over to the right, and that'd be like, in the air, or these white spots in the background. And so this sort of shows that most of the pixels in this image are kind of in, the darker range of brightness values. So the first way that I'll show you to adjust exposure and brightness is simple auto exposure. And this will often be on your camera or in your software, and this will be implemented differently across all kinds of software and cameras and whatnot. But it basically just looks at the histogram of an image. And like I say, on this one, it would be like, well, this looks like quite a bit of your pixels are in the darker areas of your photo. And generally across photos, you want it sort of more evened out, though that's obviously not true across every style and every photo you would ever take. So the best it can do is make a guess. And so this auto exposure adjustment and basically pushes those values more towards the center. And you can see there's a slider here in CameraBag's version of this where you can say how much do I want your algorithm to apply, and you can just hit that and then let it sort of choose how it does it, but you can scale that amount in and out to find the exact right brightness. And so that's the first one. The second one is just regular old exposure. And so as I pull this left or right, it just makes the whole image darker or brighter. And exposure, this one in CameraBag and generally in other softwares, it's modeled off of how actual cameras work with their exposure settings. So in a film camera, if you leave the shutter open longer, it will expose the film to more light and it will be brighter. And if you leave that shutter open for a shorter amount of time, it will let in less light and it will just make the whole thing darker. But it's kind of some complicated things happen in the real world of physics when all of that happens. And so the way this is implemented in CameraBag under the hood is that there are adjustments to several different things being made, but it's basically modeled after how it would look on an actual camera if you turned the exposure time down or up. And so you can see, like for example, this little guy's ears, even when I turn this down, they're staying fairly relatively bright. And when I turn this, quite high up, there's still parts of this bark that are quite deep in shadow. And again, that emulates what would happen with a real camera if you adjusted the exposure time. But you can generally see it's pushing the brightness values of this image brighter and darker. And there's a much simpler version of this, which we'll talk about later, which is the brightness setting. But first, before that, let's talk about the next one down here, which is contrast. And you might think, contrast, that doesn't sound like we're adjusting the brightness and exposure settings in an image. But actually it is, because what contrast does is it makes the bright pixels brighter and the dark pixels darker. So you can see again in this histogram, it will push all of the bright values, all the ones on the right side of this, towards being lighter, and all the ones to the left of that being darker. And so that's what we would call contrast. And there's an advanced contrast also in CameraBag that lets you do the same thing, but it lets you choose what it would consider the center where it's pushing things away from. So when the contrast origin is like, 25% from the left, you'll notice that on the histogram, it will basically be the values to the left of that will get pushed darker, and values to the right of that or brighter than that will get brighter. So you can see kind of the center of that would be about there. But essentially, that's adjusting the brightness and darkness of different regions of this image, regions meaning brightness values. But so contrast is definitely a way to adjust brightness in your image. Like I said, there's we talked about exposure, but the fourth method that I'll talk about is just straight up brightness. And generally what this is doing in a software, and it's doing that in CameraBag, you can see it's basically just scooting up all the values to be brighter. So your blacks won't stay black at all. They'll just get pushed up towards white. And when I'm bringing this down, your whites, they won't stay white at all. They just get pushed towards black. And excuse me, this can have very specific uses, but it's probably a less universal solution for adjusting how bright you want your image to look than something like exposure. Now, the next one, number 5, is adjusting the shadows, midtones, and highlights separately. And this is like basically having 3 different exposure adjustments that each only affect a portion of the brightness ranges in your image. So as I say adjust the highlights, you'll notice this is only really adjusting the top part of the brightness values, the lighter values, the right more values in this histogram. And so as I adjust the highlights, it's just kind of scooting those over, and it's doing some fancy math so that it blends in with the values below it. But that's essentially what it's doing. And the midtones will just adjust those middle values, which in this histogram, in this particular image, most of the values are somewhere in the middle. And so this will pull a lot of those values, but it's not doing nearly as much to the highlights as it is to the middle region, the middle brightness of pixels. And similarly, the shadows is mostly just focusing, as I adjust it up and down, on the left side, or the darker values in that image, in that histogram. So this can be very handy, very powerful, just to quickly, without having to do a tone curve, which we'll talk about next, to just using 3 sliders, be able to very precisely dial in the brightness. And it's another way to adjust contrast also, because if I'm making the shadows darker and the highlights lighter, then I'm effectively changing the contrast of this image. And another thing that's kind of particular to CameraBag, not in a lot of other photo software, is to adjust the algorithm with which this is underlying, using under the hood to adjust the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. And if I do RGB, that's just, I won't go into too much of the details of this, but basically these are different algorithms that have slightly different effects on how things look in the end. Because if I do RGB, for example, as I increase the highlights and lower the shadows, it will also increase the saturation. It will make the colors look deeper and more vibrant, which sometimes that's what you want, and sometimes that's not what you want. And so I can also adjust those pixel values based on lightness, value, or luminance. And often the best thing to do is just try them out and see which one gives you the look you like, and then go with that and not worry too much about the math behind it. All right, so that was number 5, shadows, midtones, highlights. Number 6, tone curve. And this one is very powerful and kind of indispensable if you really get into photo editing. But what this is doing is basically the left-hand side of this curve, kind of like the left-hand side of this histogram, is representing the darker values in an image, and the right-hand side of this is representing the lighter values. And the top, pulling this towards the top means making things lighter, and pulling this curve towards the bottom means making things darker. So if I just pull this down, it's saying, since it's on the right side of this histogram, I'm adjusting the brighter values in the image, and it's saying I'm making them darker. And this would say I'm taking the darker values in the image and making them lighter, which is effectively lowering the contrast, as we've talked about before. But there's a lot of things like, for example, how we adjusted the brightness before. You can do that with a tone curve rather than using the brightness slider. Because if I just pull this side up, you can see it's pushing all values from darkest to lightest. It's making them all go towards the top of this, which represents white. And that's exactly what that brightness adjustment is doing when you turn it up. And if I do that from the right side of this and pull these down, you can see it's doing the exact same thing on my histogram that brightness slider was doing. You pull it all down to black. But if I click here and put different little nodes in here, I can separately adjust the lighter parts of the image and the darker parts of the image. And this is kind of like adjusting those shadows, midtones, highlights sliders. But there's a lot more subtlety and variety to what I can do. And especially if I turn down the whole amount of this slider, how much it's affecting it, then I can get really subtle adjustments in here to really just perfect exactly, the tones that I want to make lighter and darker. And as in those other adjustments that I've shown, I can change the algorithm that this is working with under the hood. And I'll turn this up so we can see it more clearly. But each of these algorithms of how to apply that tone curve gives slightly different looks. And so just, again, often what you'll want to do is just play around with it and tweak it, and then you'll find something that you like, and you don't have to worry too much about the underlying math, but know that there are all these different options, and if one's not quite working for you, then switch the method from RGB to luminance, for example. All right, that was number 6. Number 7, the final one, is the gamma curve. And this is in very few other photo and video editing softwares. But this is a very specific mathematical function. You'll see it on your TV. If you go into your TV picture settings and you adjust the gamma adjustment, this is using the same math that is. But this is also a curve-based adjustment. And like the tone curve, the left side represents darker values in your image, and the right side represents lighter values. You can see that from this little graphic from black to white below it. But I could turn the gamma up or down for any of those values. So if I turn the gamma up for the shadows, I'm turning it all the way up. And if I do this all the way, the whole thing will become light. And it's very much like a tone curve, except for that, like I say, you can adjust. You can turn the gamma down even on the darkest pixels. It won't have any effect, but it gives you slightly different results and often better control than a tone curve does, because it's just using different math under the hood, and because you can turn the gamma down on everything all at once, or turn it up on everything all at once. And again, just play with the curve and find values that you like. But you'll find there are photographs that you really struggle with a regular tone curve to get it to look exactly how you want. And even with all those different algorithms, that's a good time to come try the gamma curve. And one of the things that this does nicely is that it preserves saturation nicely while keeping things looking natural. And so that's something that can be a struggle with a regular tone curve. But if you're adjusting your tone curve and skin tones are looking unnatural and you can't get it to look quite right, come try a gamma curve. But that's my summary for you. Hopefully that was helpful. Try each of these different ways. They all have their uses for different in different scenarios, and enjoy your photo and video editing.